Something deeply unsettling is on the horizon, yet very few are truly prepared for what is coming. In the final months before his passing, Padre Pio was granted a vision unlike any he had ever experienced before, a revelation so terrifying that he shed tears of blood and was left in complete silence for an entire week. The weight of what he witnessed was beyond human comprehension, a vision so overwhelming that it shook him to his very soul. For years, this chilling prophecy remained hidden, but now, as events unfold around us, it has begun to take shape. The warnings he received are no longer distant predictions, they are happening right now, manifesting in ways that few can deny. The year 2025 holds something unprecedented, something that will change the course of history, and there will be no going back. Before I reveal the full scope of what Padre Pio saw, I urge you to take two important steps. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so that you don't miss critical revelations like this. Second, write in the comments, "Lord, guide me in truth." This is more than just a statement, it is an act of faith, a commitment to seeking wisdom in a time of great uncertainty. Only those who remain firm in their beliefs will have the strength to endure what is coming. Now, listen closely, for time is slipping away, and the knowledge I am about to share may forever change the way you see the world. It was a quiet and solemn night at the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo. A dim glow from the last burning candles cast flickering shadows along the silent stone corridors, where the friars had already retired to their quarters. But within the walls of Padre Pio's humble cell, something extraordinary was unfolding. For some time, he had sensed that his earthly journey was drawing to a close, but nothing could have prepared him for the terrifying vision that would be revealed to him on this fateful night. Kneeling in deep prayer, lost in solemn reflection, Padre Pio suddenly found himself enveloped in a divine light that illuminated every corner of his room. The air grew heavy with an unseen presence, a force so powerful that it made his hands tremble, his heart pound, and his body freeze in place. Then, in an instant, he was no longer in his cell. His soul had been transported beyond the limits of this world to a place where time and space no longer followed earthly laws. What he saw next was so devastating, so utterly horrifying, that tears of blood streamed down his face in sheer anguish. He beheld a world in chaos, great cities consumed by unrelenting flames, the sky darkened by an ominous, suffocating haze, and people running aimlessly in terror, searching for safety where there was none to be found. The once tranquil oceans had transformed into raging tempests, swallowing entire coastlines without mercy. Mountains that had stood firm for millennia crumbled like fragile sandcastles, swept away by an invisible force. The very fabric of existence seemed to be unraveling before his eyes. Yet, the destruction of the physical world was only the beginning. What Padre Pio saw next was even more disturbing, an unraveling of the human spirit. It was not just nature that had turned against humanity, but humanity that had turned against itself. Faith had withered, morality had become unrecognizable, and deception had taken root in every corner of society. Churches stood abandoned, once holy places left in ruins, their doors shut and forgotten. Those who had once led the faithful were now persecuted, silenced, or turned away by those who no longer sought the truth. But the most horrifying part of his vision had yet to come. Amidst the growing darkness, he saw shadowy figures, sinister entities moving among the people, whispering into their ears, planting seeds of doubt and confusion. Some saw these beings and recoiled in terror, their screams piercing the silence as they realized the truth too late. But others remained unaware, continuing on as though nothing was wrong, as though they had been blinded to the deception taking place around them. The darkness had seeped so deeply into the world that many had embraced it willingly, mistaking it for light. The monks at the monastery later recalled that on that very night, a chilling, blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, sending waves of unease through the sacred halls. They rushed to Padre Pio's cell, only to find him pale and trembling, his face marked with the unmistakable traces of blood-stained tears. Whatever he had seen had shaken him to his core. They pleaded with him to speak, desperate to understand what had happened, but no words escaped his lips. For 7 long days he remained in absolute silence, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to share the horrors that had been revealed to him. When he finally found his voice, his words were few, but they carried a warning that would never be forgotten. The world will be tested in ways never seen before. What I have witnessed has shattered my soul, but God has a plan. Only those who hold firm in faith will endure. From that moment forward, Padre Pio was never the same. He withdrew even further into prayer, carrying an urgency that those around him could not ignore. He pleaded with his followers to strengthen their faith, to seek repentance, to confess their sins frequently, and to never cease praying. He knew that humanity was standing at the edge of a great divide, one that would separate those who were spiritually prepared from those who would be caught unaware. What troubled him most was that very few were paying attention. He had seen the signs clear, unmistakable, undeniable, yet he knew that most would choose to ignore them. The warnings were everywhere, visible to those willing to see, yet the world carried on as if nothing was happening. He understood that people would dismiss the truth until the final hour, only realizing too late what had been foretold. Before his passing, Padre Pio confided in his closest followers, telling them that the time of great trials was near. He warned that only those whose faith remained unwavering, who lived in a state of grace, would be able to withstand what was coming without falling into despair or deception. His vision was not meant only for his time, it was meant for us, for today. The events he foresaw have already begun, unfolding before our very eyes, yet most remain blind to the truth. The real question is, are we prepared for what lies ahead? The terrifying vision that left Padre Pio in silent agony, weeping tears of blood, must not be forgotten. The warnings he received were not given in vain. They were a call, a plea to all who would listen. The time to awaken is now. The time to prepare is now, because soon there will be no more time left. Yet, what few truly grasp is that Padre Pio's prophecy was not some distant or abstract revelation. It was a direct warning about the years 2024 and 2025. He foresaw that before the great darkness would fully descend upon humanity, a series of undeniable signs would emerge, warnings designed to awaken those with open hearts and discerning souls. These signs, though extraordinary, would be dismissed by many as mere coincidences, written off as freak accidents or natural disasters. But for those who had eyes to see, these events would be the unmistakable fulfillment of his vision. The first of these warnings, as described by Padre Pio, was an unprecedented surge in natural disasters, events unlike anything recorded in modern history. He foresaw earthquakes striking in regions that had never before been affected, violent storms appearing out of season with terrifying force, and powerful solar storms disrupting technology across the globe. Entire nations would be thrown into disarray, infrastructure would falter, and people would be gripped with fear and confusion as their daily lives became increasingly unstable. Scientists and experts would scramble to find logical explanations for these anomalies, yet none would be able to offer an answer that truly made sense. But Padre Pio knew the truth. These were not random acts of nature, nor mere consequences of environmental changes. They were deliberate warnings, signals from the divine urging humanity to awaken before it was too late. And yet, he also foresaw that the majority of people would ignore them, brushing them aside until the consequences were undeniable. But that was only the beginning. The second warning Padre Pio foresaw was even more disturbing, an unraveling of the natural order so bizarre that even the most knowledgeable scientists would be left in stunned silence. He saw a world where the seasons would no longer follow their familiar patterns, where nature itself seemed to be in rebellion. Flowers would bloom in the dead of winter, their delicate petals unfolding beneath skies thick with frost, while snow would fall in the height of summer, blanketing lands that should have been basking in the warmth of the sun. This, he explained, was no mere meteorological anomaly. It was a reflection of something far greater, a spiritual disorder manifesting in the very fabric of creation. The earth itself would cry out, mirroring the deep unrest that had taken hold of humanity. This shift, he warned, would not be random. It would be a clear sign that the world was accelerating toward an era of darkness, not just in the physical sense, but on a much deeper, spiritual level. As the planet trembled under these inexplicable disturbances, something even greater loomed on the horizon, a catastrophic shift that would shake the very foundation of society. Padre Pio saw that in the year 2025, a global event of unparalleled magnitude would unfold. He witnessed a complete and sudden collapse, a widespread breakdown of economic and governmental stability that would send shockwaves across every continent. Institutions that had seemed unshakable for centuries would crumble overnight. Banks would close their doors without warning, entire financial systems would falter, and currencies that had once been trusted would lose their value in an instant. Panic would spread like wildfire, gripping millions with a fear unlike anything they had ever known. Nations would rush to contain the crisis, implementing desperate measures to regain control, but their efforts would be in vain. Every attempt to restore stability would only accelerate the inevitable downfall. The world, once structured and predictable, would become a landscape of uncertainty, and in the midst of this chaos, a supposed solution would emerge, one that seemed to offer hope, but carried with it unseen consequences. At first, this new system would appear to be a necessary response, a safeguard against further disaster. It would be introduced under the banner of security and relief, a method to restore order and ease the suffering of the masses. Many would embrace it, seeing it as the only way forward. But what few would realize was that hidden beneath its promises lay something far more insidious, a spiritual snare so carefully woven that only those with true discernment would recognize its danger. Padre Pio saw that those who unquestioningly accepted this system would unknowingly sever themselves from something far greater. It would subtly reshape daily life, altering the way people interacted, the way they thought, even the way they perceived reality itself. Those who embraced it without hesitation would be drawn into a web of deception so intricate that they would not even recognize they had been ensnared. And while the majority would celebrate its arrival, those with understanding would refuse to partake, knowing the gravity of the choice before them. This was not simply a test of endurance, it was a test of faith. But what he saw next was even more terrifying. The fourth revelation in Padre Pio's vision was one of the most sinister of all, a deception so grand that it would infiltrate every household, reaching even the most devout believers. He foresaw how the very devices that people trusted for information, for communication, for entertainment, televisions, computers, screens of all kinds, would become the primary instruments of manipulation. Through these mediums, false signs and wonders would be projected to the world, illusions so convincing that even the faithful would struggle to discern reality from fiction. Events that appeared miraculous would be presented before billions, swaying hearts and minds, leading them toward an illusion carefully constructed to deceive. Lies would be painted as truth, and truth would be buried beneath layers of falsehood, making it nearly impossible to distinguish one from the other. Padre Pio saw how this deception would reach across continents, shaping opinions, distorting perception, and ultimately influencing the very fabric of reality. Those without spiritual discernment would fall under its influence, believing every word, every image, every carefully crafted illusion without question. They would unknowingly surrender their ability to think critically, allowing themselves to be guided down a path that led them further and further away from the truth. And then, finally, came the last warning, the most harrowing of all. Padre Pio saw that after these events had begun to unfold, a final moment of decision would arrive. The world would stand at a crossroads, and every soul would be faced with a choice unlike any before. This was not simply about survival, it was about something far greater. It was a moment of spiritual reckoning, a time when the hearts of humanity would be tested to their very core. There would be no disguising the truth anymore. No more illusions, no more distractions. The reality of what had been unfolding would become undeniably clear, and every person would have to decide would they stand firm in faith, trusting in the divine, or would they be swept away by the tide of deception. Padre Pio's final prophecy was not one of despair, but of urgent preparation. He had seen that while many would falter, those who remained strong in their faith, who sought wisdom and discernment, would endure. They would not be led astray, for they would recognize the truth even when the world tried to conceal it. The question now is simple. Are we ready for what lies ahead? The warnings have already begun. The signs are here for those who choose to see. But the time to prepare is not tomorrow, it is now. Padre Pio foresaw that the year 2025 would mark a critical turning point for humanity, a moment he described as the Great Separation. It would be a time when every soul on earth would be confronted with a decision that could not be avoided. There would be no room for half-hearted belief, no space for neutrality. Every person would be forced to stand either in the unwavering light of divine truth or be consumed by the great deception that would engulf the world. The time of indecision would come to an abrupt end, and in that final moment, the true nature of each heart would be revealed not through mere words, but through the choices made when all illusions had been stripped away. This trial, Padre Pio explained, would not be an act of punishment, but a test permitted by God, an opportunity for every individual to reveal where they truly stood. Those who had remained steadfast in prayer, who had nurtured their faith and fortified their spirits, would have the strength to endure. But those who had allowed themselves to be swept away by worldly distractions, who had ignored the call to deepen their relationship with the divine, would find themselves unprepared, caught in the storm of deception before they even realized what was happening. Yet, Padre Pio was clear. The events of 2024 and 2025 were not the end. They were merely the beginning, the prelude to an even greater test that all of humanity would face. The only question that remains is whether we are ready. On a silent night, beneath the dim flicker of candlelight in his monastery cell, Padre Pio received one of the most terrifying revelations of his life. He saw a time when complete and utter darkness would descend upon the earth, a period when both the sun and the moon would cease to shine, plunging the world into an abyss of fear and chaos. He called this event the 3 days of darkness, a purification so profound that only those who were spiritually prepared would endure it without succumbing to overwhelming terror. In this vision, Padre Pio saw the unimaginable. Streets that were once filled with life would fall silent, homes would be barricaded as families clung together in desperate prayer, and an eerie stillness would suffocate the air, pressing upon the world with an unbearable weight. But this darkness was not merely physical. It carried a spiritual heaviness unlike anything humanity had ever known. During these 3 days, he saw that demonic entities hidden in the shadows for so long would be released to roam freely upon the earth. These beings would take on forms both familiar and unfamiliar, imitating loved ones, calling out in their voices, knocking on doors, and pleading to be let inside. Those who lacked discernment, those who had allowed fear to take root in their hearts, would be deceived into opening their doors, and they would not survive what followed. Many have asked, how can one survive the 3 days of darkness? Padre Pio's answer was firm and clear. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Do not open them for anyone, no matter what voices you hear. He warned that even the voices of one's own family members could be used as a deception by the forces of darkness. Only unwavering faith and constant prayer would serve as protection. He revealed that the only source of light during these dreadful days would come from blessed candles. Every form of electricity would fail, all technology would cease functioning, and all communication with the outside world would become impossible. In his vision, he saw the sign that would precede the arrival of this darkness, a deafening roar in the heavens, like thunder that would shake the entire earth. It would be the final warning, the last moment for preparation. And then the sun would vanish. An impenetrable shadow would sweep across the planet, a darkness so thick that no artificial light could pierce it. For those unprepared, despair would set in almost immediately. They would realize, far too late, the gravity of what was happening. Cries of anguish would echo through the night as fear gripped the hearts of millions. People would run aimlessly, searching for answers that would not come, their minds overwhelmed with terror. Yet, amid this nightmare, there would be hope. Padre Pio saw that those who remained steadfast in their faith, those who devoted themselves to prayer and sought refuge in the divine, would be untouched by the horrors outside. He saw that those who recited the rosary, who trusted in God's protection, would become invisible to the forces of darkness. After 3 days of unimaginable suffering, a piercing light would break through the shadows, and the world would awaken to a new dawn. But Padre Pio left a final warning. After the darkness, nothing will ever be the same again. This prophecy is not meant to instill fear, but to awaken those who have ears to hear. It is a divine warning, a call to prepare, to strengthen one's faith, and to understand that purification must come before redemption. The signs have already begun to unfold, and those who are vigilant will recognize them. The real question is not if these events will come to pass, but whether we will be ready when they do. Those who have eyes to see and ears to hear must take this time to turn toward faith, to seek wisdom, and to prepare their souls for what lies ahead. Padre Pio's vision revealed a terrifying reality, a world where truth would become a rarity, where deception would reign so completely that even the most faithful would struggle to discern what was real. He saw families divided, traditions erased, and an overwhelming darkness consuming the hearts of millions, leaving them wandering in a state of confusion. This was not merely a test of strength, but the final battle between light and darkness, a moment in history where evil would make its ultimate attempt to dismantle all that God had established. Yet he also saw hope. He knew that those who remained vigilant, steadfast in prayer, and anchored in faith would recognize the unmistakable signs. These would not be random occurrences but divine warnings, given as a final plea for humanity to awaken, repent, and return to God. Throughout history, God has never abandoned his people without first sending signs to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. The flood in Noah's time, the plagues of Egypt, and the visions of the prophets all were warnings given to prepare those who were willing to listen. Padre Pio saw that in the last great test, humanity would be divided into 2 groups. The first group would be those who succumbed to fear, desperately seeking guidance from voices that promised false hope, leaders who would offer quick, deceptive solutions, but who had no truth within them. These individuals, blinded by the comforts of the material world, would refuse to acknowledge the reality of what was happening. They would go about their daily lives as if nothing were changing, chasing wealth, indulging in pleasure, and ignoring every divine warning unfolding before them. The second group would be those who remained rooted in faith, steadfast in prayer, and unwavering in their devotion. These individuals would receive the gift of discernment, an inner knowing that would prevent them from being misled by the great deception. They would witness the turmoil around them, the confusion, the collapse of society, but they would not be consumed by it. Their faith would be their shield, and their prayers would be their refuge. As we observe the world today, we must ask ourselves, are we already witnessing the very events that Padre Pio foresaw? Are we seeing the unraveling of nature, not as a mere environmental shift, but as a divine warning of a deeper spiritual collapse? Padre Pio made one thing clear: the answer is not to run, not to hide, but to strengthen the soul. The key to enduring what is to come is not found in fear, but in faith. Now that the signs have begun to appear, each of us must make a decision. Will we be swept away by the confusion and deception of the world, or will we stand firm in faith? The time to choose is quickly running out. One of Padre Pio's most chilling visions revealed a future where humanity would become enslaved by a grand illusion, one so powerful that even the most faithful would be at risk of being led astray. But unlike past deceptions, this one would not come through visible oppression or external control. Instead, it would be far more insidious, a deception woven into the very fabric of daily life, so seamless that few would even recognize it was happening. He saw a world where people no longer sought truth through faith or discernment, but instead placed their trust in what they saw on their screens. The manipulation of images, the fabrication of narratives, and the engineering of perception would become the new reality. People would not realize they were being deceived because the deception would be so convincing, so all-encompassing, that it would appear indistinguishable from truth. In his vision, Padre Pio saw world leaders harnessing technology in a way never before imagined, creating false miracles so breathtakingly realistic that even the devout would struggle to tell the difference. These events would not be supernatural, but they would appear to be. Technology, he warned, would advance to such a degree that humanity would become dependent on it for everything: communication, knowledge, guidance. Yet, in the wrong hands, this technology would not be used for enlightenment, but for enslavement of the mind and soul. Social media, entertainment, and news would no longer simply inform. They would shape reality itself, molding perceptions until people no longer sought truth, but only accepted what was presented to them. Padre Pio saw images projected into the sky, figures that seemed sacred, voices that seemed divine, miracles that appeared undeniable. But none of them were real. Instead, they were elaborate illusions designed for a singular purpose: to lead humanity away from God. These false signs and wonders would be so compelling that many would believe they were witnessing divine intervention. They would fall to their knees, not realizing that the force they were worshiping was not from heaven, but from the hands of those who sought control over their very souls. This, he warned, would be the final and greatest test of faith. In a world where seeing is believing, would people trust their eyes or their spirit? Would they follow what was presented before them, or would they listen to the still, small voice within, warning them to remain vigilant? Padre Pio left no doubt. Those who are rooted in faith will not be deceived. Those who remain steadfast in prayer, who refuse to be swayed by the shifting illusions of the world, will recognize the deception for what it is. But those who have neglected their spiritual lives, who have allowed themselves to drift from prayer and discernment, will be swept away without even realizing it. This is why the choice must be made now. Faith is not something that can be built in an instant. It is a foundation that must be strengthened long before the storm arrives. And the storm is coming. The world as we know it is standing at the threshold of a great trial, one that will determine the course of humanity's future. We are being given a choice to remain steadfast in faith or to be led astray by the illusions of the age. The question is no longer if these events will unfold, but when. And when they do, will you be prepared? Padre Pio warned that a time would come when technology would not just entertain or inform, but would be used as a powerful tool to shape perceptions, emotions, and beliefs. He foresaw a deception so convincing that it would lead many to place their trust in illusions rather than in divine truth. People would feel a profound sense of connection to something greater, believing they had discovered a new era of enlightenment. Yet, in reality, they would be walking into a carefully crafted illusion, one designed to distance them from faith and truth. Despite this, Padre Pio also saw hope. He knew that a small but unwavering remnant of believers would resist this deception. These individuals would not be swayed by the promises of a perfect future built by human hands. Instead, they would place their trust in prayer, in faith, and in the guidance of God. They would not allow themselves to be led astray by what they saw on screens or by the voices that promised salvation through worldly means. Padre Pio's message was clear: the only way to resist this deception was through steadfast prayer, deep spiritual discernment, and an unshakable commitment to truth. Today, as we look at the rapid advancements in technology, we must ask ourselves, are we already witnessing the early stages of this great deception? Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and digital manipulation have reached levels once thought impossible. Voices can be imitated, faces can be replicated, and entire events can be fabricated with such precision that they appear completely real. If such illusions are already possible, how much more powerful will future deceptions be? Padre Pio's warning remains as relevant as ever: not everything we see is truth. Only through faith can one discern the difference between divine miracles and illusions designed to lead the world astray. The world is moving swiftly into an age where deception will become more sophisticated than ever before. Those who rely solely on what they see and hear in the digital realm will be at risk, while those who trust in God's wisdom will remain grounded in truth. The question is, when this deception reaches its peak, will you recognize it for what it is, or will you be among those who are unknowingly led astray? According to those closest to Padre Pio, he left behind a final, handwritten message, a document so significant that it was to remain hidden until the world reached a moment of great crisis. He knew that there would come a time when humanity would stand on the edge of a transformation unlike any before, and only then would the world be ready to hear his final warning. Those entrusted with protecting this document claimed that Padre Pio had warned them that its revelation would take place within this generation, and that the very events he foresaw would unfold in our lifetime. It is believed that Padre Pio received this final revelation in the last months of his life, during one of his most profound and terrifying visions. The vision was so overwhelming that it left him in silence for 7 days, his face marked with tears. After that encounter, he knew that his mission on earth was nearly complete, but he also understood that humanity had yet to face challenges beyond anything it had previously endured. Sealed within this document are not only warnings of what is to come, but also guidance on how the faithful can remain steadfast. These were not prophecies meant to instill fear, but messages of preparation, instructions for those who would endure the most trying times in history. The reason this document is so significant is that Padre Pio predicted that before it was unsealed, humanity would begin witnessing undeniable signs, clear indications that the final days of preparation had arrived. These signs would not be subtle, nor would they be easily dismissed as mere coincidences. They would serve as markers, separating those who understood the truth from those who remained blind to it. Among these signs, Padre Pio described a disruption in the natural order, the climate shifting in ways that defy logic, with seasons merging, unpredictable weather patterns emerging, and disasters striking with unprecedented intensity. Scientists would struggle to explain these changes, yet they would be clear indicators of the unfolding prophecy. A spiritual confusion, unlike any before, false teachings would spread, and many who once held strong faith would begin to doubt. New belief systems, promising peace and enlightenment, would captivate millions, yet they would subtly distort the truth, leading many away from their spiritual foundations. A rise in technological illusions events would be broadcast across the world, appearing as miraculous signs, yet they would be nothing more than orchestrated deceptions designed to manipulate hearts and minds. The division of believers, those who remained steadfast in their faith, would face increasing isolation, as society moved toward a belief system that sought to unify through compromise rather than truth. A period of profound darkness before the prophecy reached its full completion. The world would experience an event unlike any before, a time when everything would come to a standstill, forcing humanity to confront its spiritual reality. Now, as the year 2025 begins, it is believed that this long-hidden document is on the verge of being revealed. Behind closed doors, those within the Church are reportedly in deep discussion, considering how to release its contents without causing widespread fear or misunderstanding. The question remains, why now? Why is this document suddenly being brought into discussion? Could it be that the events Padre Pio warned of are beginning to align too perfectly with what we are witnessing today? The reality is that change is unfolding rapidly, and many are sensing a shift that cannot be ignored. Whether one chooses to see these events as mere coincidences or as divine signs, one thing remains certain: faith must be stronger now than ever before. In a world increasingly dominated by uncertainty, deception, and confusion, only those who hold firm to truth will have the discernment to see clearly. Padre Pio's final message was not one of despair but of hope. He did not leave behind these warnings to instill fear, but to prepare those who would listen. The time for distractions is over. The time for preparation is now. The world is changing in ways that many do not yet understand, but those with faith will not be caught off guard. The only question that remains is when the truth is revealed, will you be ready to hear it? Padre Pio foresaw a time when the world would be on the brink of complete transformation, where confusion, uncertainty, and deception would grip humanity like never before. Yet, amid the darkness, a powerful outpouring of divine grace would be given to those who remained faithful. In his vision, he saw that as society descended into crisis, God would raise up a chosen remnant, a group of individuals who would stand firm, unwavering in their devotion, and who would be blessed with extraordinary spiritual gifts. These gifts would not be mere talents or learned skills, but manifestations of divine power, meant to strengthen the faithful and serve as a beacon of hope in a time of great turmoil. Padre Pio described these miracles as so undeniable, so beyond human comprehension, that even those who had spent their lives doubting would struggle to explain them away. The presence of the divine would become unmistakable, and those who were chosen to carry out this mission would be filled with a supernatural strength that could not be shaken by fear, deception, or the trials that lay ahead. He saw that these individuals would come from all walks of life, men and women, young and old, from every nation and background. They would not be selected based on status or worldly power, but by the depth of their faith and their willingness to trust in God completely. Many of them would have endured suffering, rejection, and hardship long before the great trials began. Yet, these experiences were not mere misfortunes. They were a form of divine preparation, a refining process that strengthened their souls and made them ready for the mission they were destined to fulfill. Padre Pio's vision revealed that these chosen ones would be given spiritual gifts unlike anything seen before. Some would receive the gift of healing, allowing them to restore the sick and afflicted in ways that defied medical understanding. Others would be granted wisdom and discernment, able to see through deception and recognize the truth even when the world was blinded by illusion. Some would be given the ability to perform great acts of faith, moving mountains both spiritually and physically through their prayers alone. Most astonishing of all, Padre Pio foresaw a time when the barriers between heaven and earth would seem to thin, allowing divine interventions to become a daily reality. Those who remained steadfast would witness visions, hear heavenly guidance, and experience miracles that had not been seen since the days of the apostles. The purpose of these gifts was not to glorify the individuals who received them, but to strengthen and prepare all who sought truth. These chosen ones would act as spiritual lifelines, leading many back to faith at a time when deception would be at its peak. But there was a warning attached to this vision as well. While the faithful would receive these divine gifts, those who had rejected the truth would be drawn into a deception so deep that they would struggle to break free. Many would place their trust in the systems of the world, believing that human advancements and solutions held the key to their future. They would become reliant on what they could see and touch, ignoring the deeper reality unfolding around them. The divide between those who walked in faith and those who followed deception would grow wider, and in the final moments, there would be no middle ground. Padre Pio made it clear that the time for preparation was not in the distant future, it was now. Every moment of prayer, every act of faith, and every test endured was building spiritual strength for what was to come. The world would not recognize this process, and many would dismiss these warnings as unnecessary or exaggerated. Yet, those who listened, those who took their faith seriously, would find themselves equipped when the trials arrived. His final message was one of hope. While the world would be tested and deception would grow stronger, the faithful would not be abandoned. Those who clung to truth, who sought God's wisdom above all else, would be protected and empowered. They would not only endure but rise, shining as lights in the midst of darkness. The greatest spiritual battle in history was drawing near, but so too was the greatest outpouring of divine grace. Now the question remains: when the time comes, Will we be among those who stand unwavering in faith, or will we be swayed by fear and illusion? The choice is ours, and the time to decide is now. Padre Pio's vision revealed that in the final moments before the Great Transformation, the heavens themselves would bear witness to the unfolding of divine prophecy. These signs would not be hidden in secret, but displayed for the entire world to see undeniable manifestations that would leave no room for doubt. Yet, despite their clarity, not all would recognize them for what they were. Some would fall to their knees in awe and repentance, while others would rationalize, dismiss, or outright reject what their own eyes beheld. Among the celestial signs, Padre Pio saw magnificent lights streaking across the sky, not like ordinary shooting stars, but as radiant symbols moving with purpose, forming patterns that spoke to those with discerning hearts. Above places of deep prayer and devotion, these lights would appear as a confirmation that the faithful were being prepared. Churches, sanctuaries, and sacred sites where prayers had risen for centuries would become focal points of miraculous displays. In some cases, entire gatherings of believers would witness these wonders at once, experiencing a collective spiritual awakening that could not be denied. One of the most breathtaking visions Padre Pio described was the formation of immense crosses in the sky, shining with an otherworldly brilliance, visible to millions at once. These celestial symbols would stand as direct messages from heaven, calling the world to repentance before it was too late. He foresaw that even the sun and the moon would behave in ways never before seen, changing colors, emitting unexplained flashes of light, and moving in patterns that defied natural law, as if the heavens themselves were speaking to humanity. Yet, Padre Pio warned that these signs would not be universally accepted. Many would see them and turn their hearts toward God, realizing that the moment of decision had arrived. But others, entrenched in their skepticism, would find ways to explain them away. Scientists would offer theories, authorities would call for calm, and the media would claim them to be illusions or atmospheric anomalies. The deception would run so deep that even some believers would begin to doubt, questioning whether these signs were truly divine or merely fabrications of the mind. But those who had kept their faith pure, those who had remained steadfast in prayer and sought truth over deception, would recognize these signs for what they truly were: final warnings. They would understand that the time of preparation was coming to an end, and the moment of decision was upon them. In his vision, Padre Pio saw that these celestial signs would coincide with other extraordinary events. The world would experience sudden moments of stillness, where nature itself seemed to pause as if holding its breath. Animals would react in strange ways, sensing the unseen forces moving around them. And most striking of all, many believers would begin to receive direct revelations, dreams, visions, and divine messages meant to guide them through the coming trials. But along with these wonders would come great opposition. Just as in the days of old, when prophets were mocked and saints were persecuted, so too would those who bore witness to these miracles face ridicule. The world would divide into two distinct groups: those who recognized the truth and prepared their souls, and those who rejected it outright, choosing instead to place their faith in human explanations and worldly comforts. Padre Pio saw that this division would be the final test, the last opportunity for each soul to choose where they stood. There would be no middle ground. Neutrality would no longer be an option. Every person would have to decide: would they stand in the light of truth, or would they turn away, unwilling to accept what was unfolding before them? As the vision reached its conclusion, Padre Pio saw one last scene, a great moment of silence, as if all of creation was waiting. Then, in an instant, the final events would begin, setting into motion the fulfillment of everything he had foreseen. Now the question remains: when these signs begin to appear, when the heavens declare their message and the world reaches its turning point, will we recognize them? Or will we, like so many before us, dismiss the warnings until it is too late? Padre Pio foresaw that in the final days, many would be led astray not by open opposition to faith, but by a gradual erosion of truth. He saw false spiritual leaders emerging, preachers who spoke of love and unity, yet avoided the hard truths of repentance, holiness, and obedience to God. These leaders would redefine faith to fit the desires of the world, making it more about comfort than transformation. Their teachings would be popular because they demanded nothing: no change of heart, no sacrifice, no true commitment to righteousness. Yet, those who were truly seeking God would recognize this deception. They would see that a faith that costs nothing is worth nothing. Padre Pio warned that the greatest danger would not be the outright rejection of faith, but a slow, subtle compromise. The temptation would not be to abandon God completely, but to accept a watered-down version of faith, one that asked nothing and gave nothing in return. As these false leaders gained influence, many would fall into their trap, embracing an easy path that required no struggle. They would convince themselves that following Christ could be done without sacrifice, without standing against the tide of the world. But Padre Pio saw that in the end, this deception would lead them further and further away from God, until they no longer recognized the difference between truth and lies. The final test of faith. In his vision, Padre Pio saw that the faithful would face one final test, a moment when their faith would be put to the ultimate trial. This would not be a hidden struggle, but a defining moment for all of humanity. Each soul would be called to make a choice whether to stand firm in truth or to give in to deception. There would be no middle ground. Neutrality would no longer be possible. He saw that many who had once claimed to believe would fall away, unwilling to endure the cost of standing firm. Society would reject those who remained faithful, labeling them as outdated, intolerant, or even dangerous. The pressure to conform would be overwhelming, and many would give in rather than suffer isolation or ridicule. But those who remained steadfast, who refused to compromise, would be lifted to a new level of spiritual strength, prepared for the final mission God had for them. Padre Pio described how the world would attempt to convince believers that their faith was outdated, that they must adapt or suffer the consequences. Many churches would divide, some choosing to embrace the changing times, altering their teachings to fit the world's expectations. But others would remain unshaken, standing firm even if it meant being rejected, cast out, or ridiculed. God, he said, would allow this testing to take place, not as a punishment, but as a final purification. Those who were truly his would be made known. Their faith would no longer be about attending church or claiming to believe. It would require courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. Only those who endured would receive the strength to carry out God's final plan. In his last revelations, Padre Pio saw that before the final division, God would send one last, undeniable warning. This warning would be unlike anything seen before, a moment so powerful that no one would be able to deny it. Every person would feel it deep in their soul, an unshakable conviction that they were being called to make a choice. Some would turn to God in repentance, realizing that they had been deceived and seeking mercy before it was too late. Others, hardened in their hearts, would reject the warning, choosing to follow their own desires rather than submit to the truth. After this warning, the world would never be the same. The final events would unfold rapidly, separating the true believers from those who had only followed out of habit or convenience. The time of decision would be over, and every soul would stand in the place they had chosen. Padre Pio left this message not to cause fear, but to prepare the faithful. He did not want people to be caught off guard, unaware of the choices that lay ahead. His vision was not one of despair, but of hope for those who remained steadfast, who held on to their faith even when the world turned against them. Now, as we look around, as we see the world shifting in ways that align with his warnings, we must ask ourselves, are we truly prepared? Are we rooted in faith strong enough to withstand what is coming? Will we recognize the deception when it arrives, or will we be led astray? The answer lies not in fear, but in faith. Padre Pio's message was clear: those who remain steadfast in God will not be abandoned. Those who hold firm to the truth will be strengthened. and those who refuse to compromise will be counted among the faithful remnant who will endure until the end. Padre Pio emphasized that the only way to resist deception in the final days would be through unwavering faith, continuous prayer, and deep discernment guided by the Holy Spirit. He warned that trusting human voices alone would not be enough. Only those who remained rooted in God's truth, listening directly to Him, would have the clarity to recognize and withstand the great deception. In one of his last revelations, Padre Pio foresaw that after this immense test, the world would be transformed forever. Those who had endured with faith would emerge purified, like gold refined in fire, strengthened and prepared for their divine purpose. He saw that these individuals would be entrusted with great missions, becoming beacons of light in a world that had been shaken to its core. Even now, the great separation has already begun. Each day, people are being faced with choices that reveal the condition of their hearts. When the time of true testing arrives, where will you stand? Will you remain steadfast in truth, or will you be among those who succumb to deception? Padre Pio foresaw a time when hardened hearts would soften, and those who had long abandoned their faith would feel an irresistible pull back toward God. This would not be a movement fueled by media campaigns, social influence, or human marketing, but a sovereign work of the Holy Spirit. It would sweep across the earth, reaching places that had never before experienced a spiritual revival. This would not be an event orchestrated by men, nor would it be confined to churches or large gatherings. Instead, it would spread like wildfire, touching individuals in the most unexpected places, calling them home to the truth. It would be a supernatural move that no human power could control, for it would be God Himself drawing people back to Him for the final time. Padre Pio saw that those who were touched by this divine outpouring would feel an unshakable fire burning within them. No amount of opposition, ridicule, or worldly distraction would extinguish it. A hunger for prayer would awaken in them like never before, and they would receive extraordinary spiritual discernment. Mysteries that had remained hidden for generations would be revealed to those who were prepared to receive them. During this outpouring, Padre Pio saw an unprecedented wave of miracles taking place across the world. Not small, occasional wonders, but mighty, undeniable acts of divine intervention. He saw the sick being healed instantly, those whom doctors had declared incurable would rise in full health, simply through the power of prayer. The blind would regain their sight, the paralyzed would walk, and those on the brink of death would experience complete restoration. Yet, this revival would not be just about physical healing. More importantly, it would be about breaking the unseen chains that had bound people for generations. Fear, addiction, despair, and deception would be shattered not by human effort, but by the overwhelming presence of God. Those who had spent their lives lost in spiritual darkness would suddenly see the light of truth for the first time. Even those who had mocked God, ridiculed believers, and denied the power of faith would find themselves brought to their knees in repentance. This would be a time of profound joy, restoration, and renewal for many, but not for all. Padre Pio foresaw that this final revival would not last forever. He understood that while multitudes would be saved, there would also be many who would reject it. Some would refuse to acknowledge the miracles unfolding before their very eyes, hardening their hearts even further. Rather than embracing the truth, they would mock those who turned to God, dismissing them as misguided or extreme. He knew that this revival was not only a great blessing, it was also a final warning. It would be God's last act of mercy before the world entered a period of great trial. Those who embraced this awakening would be strengthened, filled with supernatural courage to endure whatever came next. They would be equipped with unwavering faith, ready to stand firm no matter the cost. Padre Pio also saw that this revival would not be led by famous religious figures or high-ranking leaders. Instead, God would raise up ordinary people, those who had remained faithful in silence, who had endured hardships without wavering. These humble servants would be the ones entrusted with carrying the light of truth to the darkest corners of the world. Yet, despite the magnitude of this movement, Padre Pio issued a serious warning. The door of mercy will not remain open forever. There will come a moment when the opportunity for repentance will pass, and those who ignored or rejected this call will face the consequences of their choice. He saw that those who had been filled with the Spirit during this revival would be the ones who endured to the end. They would not fall into fear or confusion. They would stand firm, carrying the message of hope, even as the world around them grew darker. This revival, he revealed, was already beginning. The signs were appearing, and those who were spiritually awake could already sense it. But the question remains, are we ready to receive this outpouring of the Holy Spirit, or will we let this opportunity pass us by? Padre Pio's vision did not end with revival, he also saw what would follow. He witnessed a great celestial event, a sign in the heavens so astonishing that it would leave the world in awe. The sky would darken, and then suddenly a great light would appear, brighter than anything ever seen before. It would be a final announcement from God, signaling that the time of grace had ended. Some would fall to their knees in repentance, realizing too late what had happened. Others would dismiss it, attempting to explain it away as an astronomical anomaly. But those who had listened to God's call would know exactly what it meant. The final separation had begun. Padre Pio saw that after this final sign, humanity would be divided into two groups. The sealed, these were the ones who had endured, who had embraced the revival and surrendered their lives fully to God. They would be spiritually protected, strengthened with divine wisdom, and filled with courage to stand firm no matter what came next. Though they would face trials, they would not be shaken. The unprepared, these were those who had ignored or rejected the call. They had been given every opportunity to turn back to God, but had chosen the world instead. When the final moment came, they would realize their mistake, but by then it would be too late. Padre Pio saw what would follow, and it was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The age of grace would close, and the world would enter a time of great trial. Those who had been sealed in the revival would endure, standing firm in their faith despite all opposition. But those who had refused to listen would be left vulnerable, facing a time of spiritual darkness with no way to turn back. So the question remains, where do you stand? Are you among those who are spiritually awake, preparing for what is to come? Or are you among those who will ignore the warning until it is too late? Padre Pio's vision was clear. There will be no second chances after this final awakening. The time of mercy is now, but it will not last forever. Each of us is making a choice, whether we realize it or not. The decisions we make today are shaping where we will stand in the final hour. Padre Pio's final words remain an urgent message for us today. The time to prepare is now. Do not wait. Do not assume there will be another opportunity. The door of grace is still open, but soon it will close forever. So, what will you choose? Will you stand in the light of truth, or will you be caught unprepared when the moment comes? As the vision continued to unfold, Padre Pio saw that those who had embraced the Great Awakening would be drawn together, forming a remnant unlike any the world had ever seen. They would not be defined by nationality, social status, or background, but by their unwavering faith and commitment to the truth. These individuals, despite the turmoil surrounding them, would experience a supernatural peace, one that no worldly fear or uncertainty could shake. They would know in their hearts that they had been chosen, not for privilege or comfort, but for a divine mission that would demand everything of them. The strength they carried would not be of their own making, but would flow directly from the presence of God dwelling within them. They would walk through the coming trials with courage, their steps guided by an unseen force that would never fail them. Yet, even as this remnant grew stronger, Padre Pio saw the world around them descending into even greater deception. The warnings had been given, the truth had been revealed, and yet many continued to ignore it, dismissing the signs as mere coincidences or figments of imagination. They placed their trust in what they could see, in the voices that reassured them that nothing was wrong, that life would continue as it always had. These were the ones who had allowed themselves to be blinded, who had chosen the comfort of illusion over the difficulty of truth. No matter how many miracles they witnessed, no matter how many divine signs appeared before them, they would find a way to explain them away, convincing themselves that everything was simply a product of natural causes or human invention. Padre Pio saw that the deception had become so deep that even when the sky itself declared the final warning, many would turn their eyes away, refusing to acknowledge the reality before them. The division was no longer subtle. The world was splitting into two paths, and there was no longer room for neutrality. Those who had once lived with one foot in faith and one foot in the world would be forced to choose, and for many, the decision would come too late. Some would scramble to turn back to God, realizing in the final moments that they had wasted their time chasing after temporary comforts, but the door of mercy would already be closing. Others would harden their hearts further, clinging desperately to the fading illusion that nothing had changed, even as the evidence of divine intervention surrounded them. Fear would take hold of those who had ignored the warnings, a fear that would drive them to desperation, to rash decisions that would seal their fate. They would seek solutions in the wrong places, placing their trust in the very system that had led them astray. They would look for leaders to save them, for technology to protect them, for any way to regain the stability they had once known. But no worldly power would be able to restore what had been lost, and the peace they so desperately sought would remain out of reach. The final deception would take hold in ways that even the faithful had not fully anticipated. Padre Pio saw a time when the world would be offered a solution so appealing, so seemingly perfect, that many who had resisted the previous deceptions would be tempted to accept it. It would promise security in a time of uncertainty, stability in a world collapsing under its own weight. It would be presented as the only logical way forward, the only hope for restoring order. Those who questioned it would be cast aside, ridiculed, and labeled as dangerous, as obstacles standing in the way of progress. The pressure to conform would be immense, far greater than anything seen before. Families would be divided, friendships shattered, entire communities torn apart by the weight of the decision. Those who refused to accept this new system would find themselves increasingly isolated, unable to participate in the society that had been rebuilt around it. Yet, Padre Pio saw that the remnant would not waver. They would recognize this deception for what it truly was, and they would stand firm, no matter the cost. Despite the growing darkness, Padre Pio's vision was not without hope. He saw that even in the most desperate moments, God would not abandon his people. Miracles would continue to unfold, not as grand spectacles, but as quiet assurances for those who remained faithful. Food would appear when there was none, shelter would be provided in the most unexpected places, and protection would be granted in ways that defied all logic. Those who had placed their trust in God rather than in the systems of the world would not be forsaken. They would find strength where others found weakness, peace where others found fear. They would know with absolute certainty that their faith had not been in vain. While the rest of the world descended into chaos, they would walk with clarity, guided not by human understanding, but by divine wisdom. This was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something far greater. Padre Pio saw that even as this remnant remained steadfast, the final trials would intensify. Those who had chosen deception would soon find themselves trapped in a system they could not escape, one that demanded more of them than they had ever imagined. What had begun as a promise of security would turn into something far more controlling, shaping every aspect of their lives until they no longer recognized who they had become. The choices they had made in moments of fear would now dictate their futures, and many would realize too late that they had given away something far greater than their freedom. Despair would take hold of those who had trusted in false assurances, and as the world continued to unravel, they would be left with nothing but regret. But for the faithful, the journey was far from over. Padre Pio saw that those who had endured would soon witness the most incredible moment in history, the final triumph of light over darkness. The deception, no matter how strong, could not last forever. Truth, no matter how hidden, could never be fully extinguished. When the moment came, the illusion that had held the world captive would shatter, revealing reality for what it truly was. Those who had stood firm, who had refused to compromise their faith, even when it seemed impossible, would be vindicated. The suffering they had endured, the sacrifices they had made, the trials they had faced, all of it would be worth it in the end. They would see what they had been waiting for, the fulfillment of every promise, the dawn of a new beginning. As the vision came to its final moments, Padre Pio saw one last thing, a radiant light piercing through the darkness, a sign that the time of waiting was over. Those who had endured lifted their eyes, knowing that their journey had not been in vain. The struggle had been great, but the reward was greater. They had remained faithful, and now, at last, they would see the fulfillment of everything they had believed in. Padre Pio knew that this was the message he had to leave behind. A message not of fear, but of preparation. Not of despair, but of hope. The time was coming when the world would face its greatest test, but those who stood firm in faith would not be overcome. They would be ready, they would endure, and in the end, they would witness the greatest victory of all. Padre Pio's vision revealed that even as the final trials intensified, a transformation was occurring among those who had remained faithful. The world was growing darker, but within the hearts of the faithful, a light was beginning to shine more brightly than ever before. They had endured suffering, ridicule, and isolation, yet rather than breaking them, these trials had purified them, strengthening their faith beyond anything they had previously known. They no longer relied on human understanding or the assurances of the world. Instead, they walked with a divine certainty, completely surrendered to God's plan. These were the ones who had been chosen to endure, to carry the truth when so many others had abandoned it, and to be the living witnesses of God's power in the final days. Even as the deception deepened, as the world continued its descent into confusion and spiritual blindness, these faithful ones remained untouched by the illusion. They saw through the false promises, the illusions of peace and security, and the manipulations of a system designed to strip humanity of its free will. They knew that the promises being made were empty, that what seemed to be a solution was, in reality, a trap that would enslave all who embraced it. The more the world demanded conformity, the more resolute they became. They refused to give in to fear, refused to trade their faith for comfort, refused to accept a deception that would cost them their souls. And because of this, they became the greatest threat to the system that sought to control the world. In his vision, Padre Pio saw that as the final days progressed, the faithful remnant would become increasingly isolated. The world would turn against them, not through sudden force, but through gradual exclusion. Those who refused to participate in the new system would find themselves unable to function in society. They would lose access to financial resources, be denied services, and be treated as outcasts. Many would be forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in places where the world had not yet fully extended its control. Yet, despite all of this, they would not be abandoned. God would provide for them in miraculous ways, just as He had always done for those who trusted in Him. Food would appear when there was none, shelter would be found in the most unexpected places, and even in their isolation, they would experience a peace that surpassed all understanding. Padre Pio saw that the remnant would not only survive but thrive in ways that defied all logic. As the world descended further into deception and chaos, the faithful would experience the greatest spiritual outpouring in history. Those who had remained steadfast would be filled with a divine strength, empowered to carry out miracles and wonders that would leave even their enemies in awe. They would heal the sick, cast out darkness, and walk with an authority that could not be challenged. While the world sought to silence them, their presence would only grow stronger. The harder the system tried to crush them, the more unstoppable they became. They were not simply resisting the deception, they were overcoming it. But Padre Pio also saw that this would not be an easy path. Those who stood firm would face persecution, unlike anything seen before. They would be labeled as extremists, as dangers to society, as enemies of progress. Governments and leaders would declare them threats to peace, justifying increasingly harsh measures to eliminate their influence. Many would be captured, imprisoned, and even killed for their refusal to conform. But even in the face of death, they would not be afraid. They would walk willingly into the trials set before them, knowing that their faith was not in this world, but in the eternal promise of God. They would not beg for mercy, nor would they renounce their beliefs to save their lives. They would stand unshaken, knowing that the true victory was not in survival, but in remaining faithful until the end. As the vision continued, Padre Pio saw that even as the world sought to destroy the faithful, a new kind of revival was emerging. This was not like the revivals of the past, where great gatherings filled stadiums and churches with songs and celebration. This revival was different. It was silent, hidden, and yet far more powerful. It was taking place in the hearts of individuals, in small gatherings, in secret places where the faithful met in whispers and in prayers. It was a revival born not out of prosperity, but out of suffering. Those who had lost everything for their faith discovered that they had, in fact, gained something far greater. They had stepped into a faith that no longer wavered, no longer feared, no longer depended on the approval of the world. They had become warriors, purified by fire, carrying a faith so unbreakable that nothing could stand against them. Padre Pio saw that as this silent revival grew, so too did the desperation of the world that had rejected it. The deception that had once seemed so powerful was beginning to falter. The promises made by the system were failing, the security offered had crumbled, and the people who had embraced the illusion were beginning to realize that they had been deceived. Fear gripped the hearts of those who had once mocked the faithful, as they found themselves trapped in a world that no longer offered them any escape. Many would cry out, desperate for salvation, but for some, it would be too late. They had ignored the warnings for too long, and now they stood alone, without the faith that could have saved them. Yet, even in this moment, God's mercy remained. Padre Pio saw that there would still be those who, even in the final hours, would turn back to the truth. They would see the faith of the remnant, witness the undeniable miracles that surrounded them, and realize that they had been wrong. Some of them would be leaders, figures of influence who had once stood against the truth, but now found themselves unable to deny it. Others would be ordinary men and women who had spent their lives chasing after the world, only to realize in the end that nothing they had pursued could save them. For these souls, there was still hope, still a chance to step into the light before the final moment arrived. Padre Pio's vision then revealed the final separation, the moment when the division between the faithful and the deceived would be made permanent. There would be no more opportunities, no more warnings, no more time to choose. The doors of mercy would close, and every soul would stand on one side or the other. Those who had remained faithful would be gathered together, protected under divine grace, while those who had rejected the truth would face the full weight of their choices. The world as it had once been would cease to exist. The illusion would shatter completely, and what remained would be the ultimate reality, the fulfillment of every prophecy, the final act of God's plan for humanity. As Padre Pio's vision came to an end, he saw that despite all the trials, all the suffering, all the deception, the victory of God was absolute. The faithful, though tested beyond what they thought they could endure, would emerge in glory, purified and ready to step into the promise they had been waiting for. Those who had stood firm until the end would be welcomed into the eternal kingdom, where every tear would be wiped away, every wound healed, every sorrow turned into joy. And in that moment, they would understand that every sacrifice had been worth it, every trial had served a purpose, and every choice they had made in faith had led them to the greatest victory of all. The vision was not a message of fear, but of preparation. Padre Pio did not see these events as something to run from, but as something to be ready for. He knew that the time was coming, that the signs were already appearing, and that the final choice was upon humanity. The question remained, when the moment came, when the world stood on the edge of its greatest test, where would each soul stand? Would they fall into deception, or would they stand firm in truth? Would they cling to the illusions of the world, or would they surrender fully to God? The time was running out, and the decision could no longer be delayed. The final test was approaching, and only those who had prepared their hearts in faith would be ready to endure what was to come. As Padre Pio's vision continued, he saw that the world would be entering a period unlike any it had ever known, a time of spiritual awakening for some and complete deception for others. The separation that had begun would reach its final stage, where every person would be confronted with a choice they could no longer avoid. The faithful would be strengthened in ways they never imagined, but those who remained blind to the truth would be swept away by the illusions of the world, unaware that they were walking toward their own downfall. The deception would become so widespread that even those who once considered themselves believers would struggle to recognize the truth. Many would be led astray by promises of security, by voices that claimed to offer salvation yet had no connection to God. These deceivers would not come as obvious enemies, but as figures who seemed to stand for peace, unity, and progress. They would present a new vision for humanity, one that would appeal to reason and emotion alike, convincing countless souls that they were on the right path. But beneath the surface, this path would be one of submission, one that demanded people surrender their faith little by little until they no longer recognized what they had given up. Padre Pio saw that this illusion would be so powerful that even those who had once walked closely with God would begin to doubt. Some would abandon their faith entirely, convinced that the world had outgrown the need for devotion. Others would attempt to blend faith with deception, believing that they could hold on to both. But in the end, no one would be able to serve two masters. Every soul would have to decide where they stood, and the time for compromise would come to an end. Those who refused to choose would find themselves lost in confusion, unable to discern the difference between truth and lies. Yet, amidst the growing darkness, Padre Pio saw that the faithful would not be left unprotected. A great outpouring of divine power would come upon them, unlike anything that had been seen before. It would not be a power that made them famous or elevated them in the eyes of the world, but one that gave them the strength to endure the trials ahead. Those who had remained steadfast would be granted a wisdom that no deception could penetrate, a discernment that would allow them to see clearly even when the rest of the world was blinded. They would hear the voice of God guiding them, directing their steps, ensuring that they would not be led astray. This remnant of faithful believers would not be large in number, but they would be mighty in spirit. They would not seek recognition, nor would they try to convince those who had already chosen deception to turn back. They understood that the time for persuasion was over. Now the only task that remained was to stand firm in the truth. They would be drawn together, forming unbreakable bonds with one another, supporting and encouraging each other through the final trials. They would not be moved by fear, nor would they bow to the pressures of the world. No matter what they faced, they would endure, knowing that their faith was leading them to something far greater than what the world could ever offer. Padre Pio saw that this small but faithful remnant would be tested in ways beyond human comprehension. Some would be forced into hiding, separated from their families and loved ones. Others would face persecution, labeled as enemies of progress and obstacles to unity. They would be denied the right to participate in the new system, cut off from financial resources, unable to work or even buy the necessities of life. But even as they were cast out by the world, they would lack for nothing. God would provide for them, just as He had always provided for His people in times of trial. Their needs would be met in ways that defied logic. Food would appear when they had none. Shelter would be given when they had nowhere to go, and protection would come in moments when all seemed lost. In his vision, Padre Pio saw that the persecution against the faithful would intensify. The world would grow more hostile toward them, seeking to eliminate their presence entirely. Those who refused to conform would be viewed as threats, as enemies of the new order. Yet, despite the suffering they endured, they would not be broken. Their faith would only grow stronger, their commitment to God unshakable. Some would be imprisoned, others would lose their lives, but none of them would waver. They understood that the trials they faced were temporary, but the reward for their endurance was eternal. But as the vision continued, Padre Pio saw something even more extraordinary. Just as the world reached its breaking point, when it seemed as though darkness had completely overtaken everything, a great and sudden shift occurred. The faithful, who had remained hidden and persecuted, began to shine with a supernatural light. Their presence could no longer be ignored. Miracles began to unfold in ways that left even their enemies speechless. The sick were healed in an instant, the blind could see, and the lame could walk. Those who had spent their lives rejecting God could no longer deny what was happening before their eyes. Some among the deceived would finally awaken, realizing too late that they had fallen for a lie. They would cry out for salvation, desperate to turn back, but the time of mercy was reaching its end. Padre Pio saw that the doors of grace would soon close, and those who had rejected the truth for too long would have no time left to change. It was then that the final separation took place. Those who had chosen deception would remain in it, and those who had stood firm in faith would be lifted to a place beyond the reach of the world's corruption. The vision concluded with a moment of ultimate clarity. Padre Pio saw that in the end, God's justice would prevail. Every wrong would be made right, every suffering endured for his sake would be rewarded beyond measure, and every deception would be exposed for what it truly was. The faithful would inherit the promises they had waited for, stepping into a glory that surpassed all human understanding. Those who had chosen darkness would finally see the truth they had denied, but it would be too late for them to change their course. The message of this vision was not meant to instill fear, but to serve as a final call to preparation. Padre Pio did not share these revelations to terrify the faithful, but to wake them up before it was too late. The time for passive faith was over. Now was the moment to strengthen one's spirit, to walk in unwavering devotion, and to prepare for what was to come. There would be no more room for hesitation or doubt. Every soul was being called to make a choice that could not be undone. As Padre Pio's vision unfolded further, he saw that the final moments before the great separation would be unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. The world, already teetering on the edge of collapse, would be plunged into a time of great confusion and disorder. People would struggle to understand what was happening, and many would look to the wrong sources for answers. In this chaos, two distinct groups would emerge: those who had spent their lives preparing, strengthening their faith, and remaining steadfast in prayer, and those who had ignored the warnings, dismissing them as mere speculation or exaggeration. For the faithful, this period would not be one of fear, but of clarity. Though the world around them would be in turmoil, they would experience a profound sense of peace, knowing that everything that was unfolding had already been foretold. They would see the hand of God at work in ways that others could not perceive, guiding them, providing for them, and ensuring that they remained on the right path. These believers would not be shaken by the chaos because they had already surrendered their hearts to the truth. No deception, no hardship, no amount of suffering could cause them to waver, because their foundation was built on something that the world could not take away. For the unprepared, however, this period would be marked by desperation. As the systems they had trusted in began to crumble, they would search frantically for stability, grasping at anything that promised them security. Many would fall prey to deception, following leaders who claimed to have the answers, yet whose solutions only led them further from the truth. The warnings that had once been dismissed as superstition would now be undeniable, but for many, it would be too late to change course. The comforts of the world, which they had once prioritized over their spiritual lives, would vanish in an instant, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Padre Pio saw that during this time, the deception would reach its peak. It would no longer be subtle or hidden, but openly displayed before the world. Those who had spent their lives rejecting God would now be faced with a choice they could no longer ignore. But instead of turning back, many would harden their hearts even further, refusing to admit that they had been wrong. They would cling to their old ways, insisting that humanity could find its own solutions without divine intervention. Yet, deep down, they would feel an unshakable sense of dread, a knowing that everything they had placed their trust in was falling apart. Amidst this chaos, Padre Pio saw that the faithful would receive divine guidance in ways that defied human understanding. Some would receive visions directing them to places of refuge, while others would be supernaturally protected from harm. Miraculous provisions would sustain those who had chosen to stand firm, ensuring that they lacked nothing even as the world around them descended into scarcity and ruin. Those who had mocked faith, who had dismissed the warnings, would now look upon these believers with envy and confusion, unable to comprehend why they remained unshaken while the rest of the world was in turmoil. This period of final testing would separate the faithful from the deceived in an irreversible way. Those who had built their lives on truth would shine with an inner strength that no force on earth could diminish. They would not be exempt from trials, but they would endure them with unwavering resolve, knowing that their suffering was temporary and that something far greater awaited them. In contrast, those who had lived without faith would find themselves lost, unable to navigate the darkness that had overtaken the world. They would be consumed by fear, regret, and a desperate longing for the security they had once taken for granted. Padre Pio saw that even in these final moments, God's mercy would still be available to those who truly repented. There would be individuals who, in the face of undeniable truth, would finally surrender and turn back to God. These souls, though late in their awakening, would be welcomed with open arms, their past mistakes washed away in an instant. But these would be few in number, for most would be too blinded by pride, too entrenched in the deception to recognize the opportunity before them. Then, as the final separation reached its completion, a great silence would fall upon the earth. It would be as if time itself had paused, as if creation was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come next. Padre Pio saw that at this moment, the faithful would experience a deep and overwhelming presence of God, a confirmation that they had been chosen to endure, to witness the completion of the divine plan. This presence would fill them with an indescribable peace, an unshakable certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. For the rest of the world, however, this silence would be suffocating. It would be a moment of realization, a dreadful understanding that the time of decision had passed. The distractions that had once occupied their minds would be gone, and all that would remain was the weight of their choices. The world, which had been filled with noise and chaos, would now be left in eerie stillness, as if the heavens themselves were waiting for the final moment to arrive. Padre Pio's vision did not end in despair, but in a promise. He saw that the faithful, those who had endured, would not be abandoned. Though they would face trials, they would be sustained by a strength greater than their own. They would become beacons of light in the darkness, carrying forward the truth even as the world rejected them. They would walk in divine protection, guided by a force that no earthly power could overcome. Their mission would not be easy, but it would be filled with purpose, and they would find joy even amidst suffering, knowing that their faith had not been in vain. As this vision came to a close, Padre Pio left one final message, one that echoed with urgency. The time to prepare was now. Waiting until the last moment would not be enough. Strengthening one's faith, seeking the truth, and living in constant prayer were not things that could be postponed. The world was changing, the signs were already appearing, and soon the final choice would be upon every soul. There would be no more room for hesitation, no more time for compromise. The separation was coming, and each person would have to stand on one side or the other. Padre Pio's warning was not meant to instill fear, but to awaken those who were still asleep. There was still time to choose, to prepare, to turn back before it was too late. But that time was slipping away. The call was clear, and now each soul had to answer it. Would they be among those who endured, or would they be swept away by the deception of the world? That decision, once made, would be final. As the vision faded, Padre Pio knew that his mission on earth was complete. He had seen what was to come, and he had delivered the message he was entrusted with. Now it was up to each person to decide what they would do with it. The time of grace was still open, but it would not remain open forever. The final moment was approaching, and when it arrived, only those who had prepared would be able to stand firm. The question was no longer if these events would unfold, but whether or not each soul would be ready when they did. Padre Pio's vision did not end with the great separation. He saw that after this moment, when every soul had made their final choice, an irreversible shift would take place in the world. It would not be immediate, nor would it come with great fanfare. Instead, it would unfold subtly at first, like a tide withdrawing before a massive wave crashes onto the shore. Those who had been sealed in faith would feel a profound stillness in their hearts, an understanding that the time of preparation had passed. For them, there would be no more warnings, no more waiting. Their spirits would be fortified, unshaken by the unfolding chaos. Meanwhile, those who had rejected the truth would feel something different, a growing unease, an emptiness that no earthly comfort could fill. Padre Pio saw that as this shift took place, the world itself would begin to mirror the spiritual divide that had occurred. The faithful would continue to walk in divine protection, unseen forces guiding their steps, preventing them from falling into the snares set before them. They would not be immune to suffering, but they would be given the strength to endure it. Their purpose would become clear: to bear witness to the truth, to offer hope to the few who would still seek it, and to stand firm as the world around them descended into greater deception. Those who had chosen to turn away from God, however, would experience the consequences of their decision in a way they had never imagined. The illusions they had once believed in would begin to crumble, revealing the emptiness beneath them. The world's systems, which had promised security and stability, would prove to be built on shifting sand. Governments and institutions that had once seemed invincible would falter, unable to withstand the weight of their own corruption. Those who had placed their trust in material wealth would watch helplessly as it lost all meaning. And those who had sought power and influence would find that they had been nothing more than pawns in a far greater game. In his vision, Padre Pio saw that even as these events unfolded, there would still be those who clung to deception, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. They would insist that things would return to normal, that the crises were temporary, that humanity would find a way to rebuild. They would deny the obvious, convincing themselves that with enough effort, they could restore the world to what it had been. But what they failed to realize was that there was no returning to the past. The world had already passed the threshold, and nothing would ever be the same again. One of the most striking elements of Padre Pio's vision was the presence of those who had been spiritually prepared. These were not people of high status or great renown. They were ordinary men and women, yet they moved with a certainty and peace that set them apart. They did not waver in their faith, nor did they panic in the face of adversity. They had been trained in the quiet years before the storm, their spirits refined through trials and hardships. Now they would rise as beacons of light in the encroaching darkness. Padre Pio saw that these individuals would be granted wisdom beyond human understanding. They would know where to go, whom to trust, and what to do, not through their own intelligence, but through divine guidance. When the world was paralyzed by fear, they would walk forward with unshakable confidence. When deception clouded the minds of the masses, they would see with perfect clarity. When others despaired, they would offer words of hope that could only come from a place of true faith. But this time would not last forever. As the final events unfolded, a great silence would settle over the world, a silence unlike any that had ever been experienced. It would not be the silence of peace, but the stillness before the final storm. Those who had discernment would recognize it for what it was: a moment of final preparation before everything reached its ultimate conclusion. Padre Pio saw that during this time, the faithful would be given one last opportunity to strengthen their souls, to draw closer to God, and to ensure that they were fully prepared for what was to come. For those who had chosen deception, however, this silence would be suffocating. It would be the moment they realized, too late, that their opportunity for repentance had passed. Fear would grip their hearts as they sensed that something irreversible was about to take place. They would search desperately for answers, but none would come. The world, which had been filled with distractions and noise, would suddenly offer them nothing. No amount of wealth, influence, or knowledge would be able to change what was coming next. Then, in an instant, the silence would be shattered. Padre Pio saw that the final phase of his vision would begin with a great sign, something so unmistakable that no one on earth could ignore it. He did not describe exactly what this sign would be, but he made it clear that it would mark the end of the time of mercy. Those who had been sealed in faith would understand immediately, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace despite the events unfolding before them. Those who had rejected the truth, however, would be overcome with terror, knowing that they had run out of time. Padre Pio saw that after this sign appeared, the final tribulation would begin. It would be unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed, a period of intense trial that would test every soul to its core. The world's systems would collapse completely, and the deception that had once blinded the masses would be fully exposed. Those who had clung to lies would find themselves without refuge, unable to escape the consequences of their choices. The faithful, however, would remain under divine protection, guided through the darkness with unwavering faith. He saw that this period would serve one final purpose: to reveal the true nature of every heart. No one would be able to hide behind falsehoods or pretense. Every soul would be seen for what it truly was. Those who had spent their lives preparing, seeking truth, and walking in faith would shine like stars against the night. Those who had chosen deception would find themselves utterly lost, with no place to turn. Then, in a final moment of divine intervention, the separation would be complete. Those who had been faithful would be gathered, their trials at last coming to an end. They would step into the fulfillment of the promises they had held onto through every hardship. Those who had rejected the truth, however, would face the full weight of their choices. Padre Pio saw that this would not be a moment of cruelty or unjust punishment, but a simple reality: each soul would receive the outcome it had chosen. As the vision concluded, Padre Pio left one final message, a call to those who were still listening. He urged every soul to take the warning seriously, to prepare not out of fear, but out of love. He emphasized that there was still time, but that time was running out. He pleaded with those who had ears to hear, asking them to strengthen their faith, to turn away from deception, and to stand firm in the truth. He assured them that no one who sought God with sincerity would be abandoned, that even in the darkest hour, divine light would guide those who remained faithful. The choice, he reminded them, was still theirs to make. But soon, that choice would be final. The question was simple: would they be among those who endured, or among those who fell? Would they recognize the truth before it was too late, or would they dismiss it, only to realize too late what had been right in front of them all along? Padre Pio's vision was not merely a warning of what was to come, but a final plea for humanity to wake up before it was too late. He saw that there would be a moment when the doors of mercy would close forever, when every soul would have made its final choice, and the time for preparation would be over. That moment was approaching faster than most could comprehend, yet even now, many remained blind to the truth, distracted by the noise of the world and unwilling to acknowledge the signs unfolding before their eyes. As the vision neared its end, Padre Pio saw a final revelation, a glimpse of what would await those who had remained steadfast in their faith and those who had chosen deception. For the faithful, the darkness of the tribulation would not be the end, but the beginning of something far greater. He saw them standing strong, their spirits shining with an unearthly light as they endured the trials with unwavering resolve. Though they would face hardships, they would not be abandoned. The presence of God would be with them in ways they had never before experienced. They would be given supernatural peace, guidance, and protection, ensuring that no matter what happened around them, they would not be shaken. But for those who had turned away, the reality would be far different. He saw the moment when they would finally understand the weight of their choices, when the illusions they had embraced would shatter, leaving them exposed to the full force of what they had rejected. There would be no more distractions, no more false comforts to shield them from the truth. The deception that had blinded them for so long would be lifted, and in that moment of clarity, they would realize the enormity of their mistake. Yet for many, it would be too late. Their opportunity for repentance would have passed, and they would be left to face the storm with no shelter, no foundation, and no hope. Padre Pio understood that there would be no neutral ground in the final days. Every soul would be placed on one side or the other, and there would be no turning back. The separation would be absolute, and those who had chosen the world over God would find themselves standing alone, without the protection they had once taken for granted. He saw that the final tribulation would not just be a test of endurance, but a complete unveiling of the human heart. Everything hidden would be revealed, and every soul would be known for what it truly was. Yet even in the midst of this revelation, there was still hope. Padre Pio saw that God's mercy extended until the very last moment, reaching out to those who were willing to grasp it. He saw that even as the world descended into chaos, there would still be those who turned back, who fell to their knees in repentance and cried out for salvation. And for those who did, there would be grace. There would be redemption. No soul who sincerely sought God would be cast away, no matter how late they had come to the truth. But the window of opportunity was closing, and those who continued to hesitate, who convinced themselves that they had more time, were placing themselves in grave danger. As the vision faded, Padre Pio left one final message, a call that echoed across time, reaching beyond his own era into the hearts of those who would listen today. He urged all who heard his words to prepare, not out of fear, but out of faith. He reminded them that the trials ahead were not meant to break them, but to refine them, to separate those who were truly devoted from those who only followed in name. He pleaded with them to strengthen their souls, to remain steadfast in prayer, and to never allow the world's deception to take root in their hearts. He emphasized that no matter how dark the days ahead might seem, God's light would never be extinguished. The faithful would endure, and those who placed their trust in God would be guided through even the most unimaginable tribulations. He assured them that in the end, truth would prevail, and those who remained loyal to God would see the fulfillment of His promises. Then, with a deep, solemn finality, the vision ended. Padre Pio knew that he had been given a message not just for his time, but for all who would come after him. It was a warning, a revelation, and an invitation all in one. Now the responsibility lay with those who heard it. The choice was theirs to make. Would they recognize the truth and prepare, or would they ignore it until it was too late? The time of decision had arrived. The world was changing, and the signs were already unfolding. Those who had ears to hear would understand that they had been given a final chance, a last call to strengthen their faith, to reject deception, and to stand firm in the light of God's truth. But soon the opportunity would pass, and when it did, there would be no second chances. The door of mercy was still open, but it would not remain open forever. In the end, there was only one question that truly mattered. When the final moment came, when the separation was complete, and when there was no more time left to choose, where would you stand?